the more difficult issue perhaps for Tony Abbott is on industrial relations. Two former and very prominent members of the Liberal Party, Peter Costello and Peter Reith, both urged him again this week to have another look at individual contracts, but this was Tony Abbott's response to that.
I think they have every right to make a contribution to debate, and I welcome it. I made it absolutely crystal clear that there were certain policies that were part of the past and were never going to be part of our future.
He's hanging in there on that.
Well, it's a pretty fascinating little dynamic, that one, I reckon, because, you know, one of the interesting things about Tony Abbott as a leader is, you know, people in the within the coalition see him as a bit more consultative than certainly his immediate predecessor. But on this point, he's absolutely batting back, you know, some quite concerted efforts from people within his party room to get him to strengthen his stance on IR. But it doesn't do him any harm at all to be seen having arguments with
on that particular issue,
and Erica Betts and whoever.
It doesn't, but I think it's starting to be a broader thing than that, which is that he's quite clearly saying, I'm not like the Howard Costello years. I'm different. I don't necessarily follow that sort of smaller liberal ideology. I don't necessarily slavishly follow the idea of free markets, etc., etc.
That's because he's DLP, according to Peter Costello.
And the Costello piece didn't just go to industrial relations. It went to protectionism and market intervention as well. And it's almost the flip side of the negative mandate argument that if you take a small target strategy for your positive mandate, but you have a really clear ideology, then people go, OK, well, I might not know your exact policies on everything, but I know which way you're heading. I know where you're going. But if you say, I'm a pragmatist...
But don't we actually...
What does that
I think we're actually
mean?
getting quite a good idea of what Tony Abbott is like from the decisions that he's been taking on these issues. And that is that he is kind of a big government sort of a guy, isn't he? I mean, he's got a whopping great paid parental leave scheme, much more generous than the current government is offering. His approach to climate change is basically paying people to bury pellets of carbon in their backyards or farms or plant trees and all that.
That's all true, but he does try to have a bob each way too. Like he says, on the one hand, in terms of, say, industry policy, on the one hand, look, a lot of rhetoric that sounds like he'd be more willing to intervene in markets, more willing to do things that might once have looked like protectionism. Then he gives a speech and says, no, I'm all for free market. So it's hard to tell. It really is quite hard to tell in a lot of areas where he would go, and he's trying to, understandably, keep the peace in his own party and not necessarily lay down markers and create problems for himself where he doesn't need to.
He's not trying that hard to keep the peace in his own party. I mean, I think that on the IR stuff, I mean, he doesn't mind having a public scrum about
on that
this
particular
stuff.
issue. I agree.
And he's got, I mean, I think one of the things you should bookmark and remember is what he said after he took the paid parental leave scheme through the shadow cabinet. And that is, he gave one of those kind of cheeky grins and said, well, look, it's better to ask forgiveness than to seek permission. And I think that is kind of quite a big part of his modus operandi.
There was another thing in the Costello article that I found interesting, and it is something that a lot of Liberals do talk about behind the scenes. Under Tony Abbott, the National Party are in a 70s-style position. An Anthony, Nixon, Sinclair, you know, almost the second and third, fourth shadows. It's essentially Barnaby Joyce. But that Abbott has given the National Party a role that John Howard had sought to deny it through the 80s and 90s. And that is also concerning a lot of Liberals.
That's a good point.
And, of course, the National Party probably reinforcing Tony Abbott's view, which is love to spend money on behalf of the Australian people, but we're not going to take any money off them to pay for it. So this tax and spend thing that he goes on about, I know the focus groups do bear out his rhetoric, because most of this rhetoric is sharpened in focus groups. You know, this government taxes you too much, OK, well, don't tax me. This government's into wasteful spending, meaning I'll spend money better, but I'm still going to give you money. I mean, that's essentially what he's saying.
But if you line up all that he said, they're going to have to make really very substantial spending cuts to keep the promises, and it's really hard to figure out how they do that and keep all the
I know.
people happy
it's got me perplexed at the moment.